Every history book you were ever given started in the wrong place. Every documentary you have watched, every lesson you were taught, every map you were handed, all of them began the story of the Americas at roughly the same moment, with the same image, the same confident claim. A narrow land bridge, a frozen world, a small band of hunters pressing eastward through ice and silence, following mammoth herds across from Siberia into a continent that had never known a human footstep 15,000 years ago. Perhaps 13,000. That, you were told, was how the New World was peopled. That was the beginning. Except it wasn't. New evidence, genetic, archaeological, geological, has been quietly dismantling that story for decades, and what is emerging in its place is stranger, older, and far more extraordinary than anyone was prepared to admit. If you are new here, and this is the kind of history that makes you rethink everything, the buried, the contested, the deliberately overlooked, then subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this channel exists precisely for stories like this one. The question at the heart of this documentary is deceptively simple. Before the people we call the first Native Americans arrived, however they arrived, whenever that was, what was in the Americas? Who, if anyone, had come before? What lived there, what burned there, what was built and lost and erased during the 20,000 years that mainstream archaeology has spent the least time examining? It is a question that has destroyed academic careers. It has split conferences. It has generated lawsuits, suppressed findings, and produced some of the most dramatic reversals in the history of the human sciences. And the answers, when they finally started coming, rewrote not just American prehistory, but the entire story of how our species moved across the planet. To understand what was missing, you first have to understand what was officially accepted and why that acceptance was so fiercely defended for so long. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of how the Americas were peopled was called the Clovis first hypothesis. It was named for a small city in New Mexico where, in 1929 and the years that followed, archaeologists uncovered a distinctive style of fluted stone spear point alongside the bones of extinct ice age. Megafauna mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, ancient horses and camels that had once roamed a landscape so different from modern America that it would have been unrecognizable. These Clovis points, as they became known, were elegant things, large, symmetrical, precisely crafted, with a characteristic groove or flute running up the base that no one fully understood then and no one fully understands now. They appeared in the archaeological record quite suddenly, around 13,000 years ago, and then spread rapidly across the continent. Within a few centuries, Clovis-style points were being found from the tip of Patagonia to the shores of the North Atlantic. The interpretation that took hold was this. A single group of hunters had crossed from Northeast Asia into Alaska during the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough to expose a vast shelf of land between Siberia and Alaska that geologists call Beringia. From there, they had moved south through an ice-free corridor that opened between two massive glacial sheets, the Laurentide to the east and the Cordilleran to the west, and emerged onto the Great Plains like water breaking through a dam. They found a continent teeming with animals that had no experience of human hunters. The killing was easy, the expansion rapid, the peopling of two entire continents accomplished within a geological instant. The Clovis people were first Americans. End of story. Except the story had problems almost from the beginning. Small problems at first, the kind that get filed away and not discussed at conferences. A site here with dates that seemed too early. A tool technology there that didn't quite fit the pattern. Skeletal remains that suggested anatomies more complex than a single migration could explain. For decades, these anomalies were dismissed, debated away, or in some cases, quite literally reburied. The Clovis first model was not just a scientific hypothesis. It had become an orthodoxy, and orthodoxies, in any field, develop institutional immune responses to challenge. The immune response was particularly fierce in American prehistory, and for reasons that went well beyond science. The question of who was first in America is not a neutral academic question. It is entangled with questions of indigenous rights, land ownership, cultural identity, and the politics of colonialism in ways that make it uniquely sensitive. If the ancestors of modern Native Americans were not the first people in the Americas, if there were earlier inhabitants who were displaced or destroyed before the ancestors of today's tribes arrived, then the moral landscape of the continent's history becomes considerably more complicated. Some scholars worried, not without justification, that findings suggesting pre-Clovis or non-native populations in the Americas could be weaponized by those seeking to undermine indigenous land claims. The science was tangled up in politics before a single radiocarbon date had been contested. But science, in the long run, has a way of pressing through. And what has pressed through over the last 3 decades is a cascade of evidence so substantial, so multi-sourced, and so convergent that the Clovis first model is now, among most specialists, not so much contested as quietly abandoned. What has replaced it is not a single, clean alternative story, but a far messier, far richer, and infinitely more interesting picture. A picture in which humans were in the Americas far earlier than anyone dared to say publicly for most of the 20th century. A picture in which multiple waves of migration from multiple sources arrived by multiple routes across tens of thousands of years. A picture in which entire civilizations, not in the monumental sense, but in the sense of complex, adapted, continent-spanning cultures, rose and flourished and then vanished, leaving traces so faint that we are only now developing the tools to read them. This is the story of the missing 20,000 years, and it begins, as all the best stories do, with ice. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 21,000 years ago, the world looked nothing like the world we inhabit today. The ice sheets that covered the northern latitudes were not merely large, they were geological entities of almost incomprehensible scale, kilometers thick in places, heavy enough to depress the crust of the Earth itself beneath their weight. The Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of what is now Canada and extended deep into the northern United States, contained enough water to lower global sea levels by more than 120 meters. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered the mountains and coastal ranges of what is now British Columbia and Alaska. Together, they formed a barrier across the northern part of North America so complete, so absolute, that virtually nothing, not mammoths, not wolves, not humans, could pass through it. The continent south of the ice was, for the purposes of human prehistory, an island, a vast, warm, ice-free island the size of 2 continents, teeming with life, sitting beneath a frozen ceiling. What lived in that ice-free corridor south of the glaciers was a world that would take a paleontologist's breath away. The fauna of Pleistocene North America was, by any measure, one of the most spectacular assemblages of large mammals the planet has ever produced. Mammoths, the Columbian mammoth of the south and the woolly mammoth of the north, roamed in herds across grasslands that stretched from Texas to Alberta. Mastodons, more heavily built than mammoths and preferring forest and woodland, ranged across the eastern half of the continent. Giant ground sloths, some of them as large as modern elephants, moved through the landscape with a slow deliberateness that belied their enormous strength. Glyptodonts, armored creatures the size of small cars, encased in bony shells like oversized armadillos, grazed the southern grasslands. Short-faced bears, the largest ursines that ever lived, patrolled territories measured in hundreds of square kilometers. American lions and saber-toothed cats, not tigers, despite the popular name, but members of the genus Smilodon, with canine teeth the length of a man's forearm, hunted the grazers of the plains. American horses and camels, both of which had originated in North America and later migrated to the Old World, filled ecological niches that their descendants in Asia and Africa still occupy today. American cheetahs, faster than any cat alive today, chased pronghorn ancestors across the open grasslands. This was the world that the first humans entering the Americas encountered. And the question of when, exactly, that encounter began is the question that has defined and divided the field for generations. The conventional answer, right up until the last decade or so of the 20th century, was approximately 13,000 years ago. That was when the Clovis points appeared. That was when the ice-free corridor between the 2 glacial sheets opened sufficiently for foot travel, and that was when the genetic and archaeological evidence, as then understood, seemed to converge. 13,000 years ago. No earlier. Clovis. First. The unconventional answer, the answer that a handful of archaeologists were quietly whispering, then arguing, then shouting into the academic wind across the second half of the 20th century, was much, much earlier. And the site that forced that answer into the mainstream, that cracked the Clovis first model so thoroughly that it could never be fully reassembled, was a small, boggy, unremarkable-looking place at the southern tip of South America called Monte Verde. Monte Verde sits in southern Chile, in the cool, forested landscape of Patagonia, about 50 kilometers inland from the Pacific coast. It was excavated across many years by an American archaeologist named Tom Dillehay, who began working there in the mid-1970s after Chilean colleagues alerted him to unusual bones washing out of a streambed. What Dillehay found, buried under a meter of peat that had preserved organic materials with extraordinary fidelity, was a human occupation site. Not a Clovis site, not a hunting camp, a settlement. The remains of wooden structures, huts or shelters framed with logs and planks, with hearths and food remains inside, butchered animal bones, chewed medicinal plants, including several species that would have had to be collected from different ecological zones, suggesting trading or ranging behavior of considerable sophistication. And dates, radiocarbon dates that clustered, unmistakably and repeatedly, around 14,600 years ago. 14,600 years ago at the southern tip of South America. More than 1,000 years before the Clovis horizon in North America. More than 3,000 kilometers from the opening of the putative ice-free corridor, measured as the crow flies, through landscapes that offered almost no direct route. The arithmetic did not work. If people had arrived in the Americas by walking south through an ice-free corridor between the glacial sheets, they could not have been at Monteverde 14,600 years ago. The corridor did not open until after 12,000 years ago. Even if they had walked at a brisk pace, covering 40 kilometers a day across rough terrain, mountains, rivers, and unknown wilderness, they could not have reached Patagonia in time. Dillehay knew what his dates meant. He also knew what the reaction would be. For more than a decade, he sat on his data, checking it, rechecking it, having it independently verified. When he finally published, the response from the Clovis first establishment was, by academic standards, savage. The site was contaminated, the dates were wrong, the evidence had been misinterpreted. The structures were natural features, not human constructions. Dillehay was, without quite being accused of fraud, accused of incompetence on a spectacular scale. The arguments raged across the journals and at conferences for years. Then, in 1997, a team of archaeologists that included several prominent Clovis first advocates was assembled specifically to audit Monteverde, to go to the site, examine the evidence, and render a definitive verdict. They went, they looked, they argued, and then they conceded. Monteverde was genuine, the dates were valid, the structures were human-built, pre-Clovis occupation of the Americas was real. The Clovis first model was dead. It just didn't know it yet. Because the collapse of Clovis first did not immediately produce a consensus replacement, what it produced was a proliferation of competing claims, a re-examination of sites that had been dismissed for decades, and a growing recognition that the archaeology of the Americas, before 13,000 years ago, was far more complex and far more ancient than anyone had been willing to publicly acknowledge. Sites began to accumulate. Some were solid, some were contested, a few were extraordinary. The Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania, excavated by James Adavasio across the 1970s and 1980s, had been producing pre-Clovis dates for years before Monteverde was accepted. Adavasio's claims had been dismissed with the same ferocity directed at Dillehay. After Monteverde, they looked considerably more credible. The dates at Meadowcroft extended back as far as 16,000 years ago, making it, if the dates held, one of the oldest known human sites in the Americas, located not in Alaska or the Pacific Northwest, near where the first migrants were supposed to have entered, but in Pennsylvania, deep in the eastern United States. People, apparently, had been doing things in Pennsylvania when the glaciers still covered Canada. The Page-Ladson site in Florida presented an even more striking case. Submerged beneath the dark, tannin-stained waters of the Orcilla River, archaeologists found a mastodon tusk with unmistakable evidence of human modification, cut marks, and impact fractures consistent with butchering activity dated to approximately 14,500 years ago. Florida. 14,500 years ago, Ice Age Florida was not the subtropical landscape it is today. At that time, with sea levels far lower, Florida was a much larger, drier, more open landscape, its water concentrated in springs and sinkholes fed by the underlying limestone aquifer. But people were there, butchering mastodons. Before Clovis, the Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas added further complications. Archaeologists excavating at Buttermilk Creek found stone tools and flakes, roughly 15,000 of them, in sediments dated to between 13,500 and 15,500 years ago. Pre-Clovis tools in Texas, in a style unlike Clovis but clearly human-made, clearly functional, clearly the product of a tool-making tradition with its own logic and its own history. Not prototypical Clovis, something else, something older. And then there was Serutti Mastodon. In 1992, construction workers in San Diego, California, were excavating a new stretch of highway when their machinery struck something hard and unexpected in the sediment. The excavation stopped. Paleontologists arrived. What they found were the bones of a mastodon not unusual in California, where mastodon remains have turned up in construction sites for over a century. What was unusual was the condition of the bones. Several of them had been smashed in a highly specific way, with percussion marks consistent with deliberate fracture by a large, heavy stone tool, of the kind used to extract marrow from large bones, a technique as old as the genus Homo itself, and utterly characteristic of human butchery. Alongside the bones were large, flat stones, one of which bore impact marks consistent with use as a hammerstone or anvil. The configuration stones, the precise pattern of fracture looked, to the paleontologists who examined it, very much like a butchery site. A place where humans had smashed open mastodon bones to get at the rich, calorie-dense marrow inside. The dates were the problem. Or rather, the opportunity. The sediment matrix containing the bones and stones was dated using a technique called uranium series dating, applied directly to the bone itself. The date returned was not 13,000 years ago, not 14,000, not 15,000, or 16,000. The date returned was 130,000 years ago. When the results were published in Nature in 2017, the response from the scientific community was, in the politest possible description, mixed. Some researchers accepted the findings cautiously, acknowledging that the methods were sound and the evidence compelling. Others rejected them entirely, arguing that the fracture patterns could be explained by natural processes, trampling, compression, geological forces rather than human activity. The debate continues. But the implications of the Serutti Mastodon site, if the dating holds and the interpretation is correct, are so staggering that they deserve to be stated plainly. If humans were in California 130,000 years ago, then the Americas were not first peopled in the Ice Age at all. They were peopled in a warm interglacial period, more than 100,000 years before Clovis, by hominins who may not even have been fully modern Homo sapiens. The Neanderthals were still alive in Europe when those stones were being struck in San Diego. The anatomically modern humans who would eventually leave Africa and spread across the globe had not yet fully emerged. Most mainstream archaeologists treat the Serutti Mastodon site as unresolved rather than proven. The fracture patterns could have other explanations. 130,000 years ago is a date so far outside the accepted range that extraordinary evidence is required to support it, and the current evidence, while suggestive, does not universally compel. But the site exists. The dates exist. The bones are real, and in a field that has already been wrong once, spectacularly, definitively wrong about Clovis, first the wise response is probably not outright dismissal. The question that Monteverde, Meadowcroft, Page Ladson, Buttermilk Creek, and the Serutti Mastodon site collectively force us to ask is not just when did people first arrive in the Americas, it is how. Because if people were at Monteverde 14,500 years ago, they could not have walked there via the ice-free corridor. The corridor didn't exist yet. Something else brought them. And the growing consensus among researchers who have looked hardest at this problem points not to the center of the continent, but to its edges. Not to a land bridge and a corridor, but to a coastline and boats. The Kelp Forest Highway hypothesis, sometimes called the coastal migration model, proposes that the first Americans did not come through the interior of Alaska and down the ice-free corridor, but along the coasts. Specifically, along the Pacific coastline of the North American continent, moving in boats or by foot along shores that were, during the Ice Age, dramatically different from what they are today. With sea levels more than 100 meters lower than they are now, the continental shelf was exposed. What is today the shallow sea floor off the coasts of California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska was then dry land, or at least coastal plain, with rivers running to a sea that was much further out. The kelp forest hypothesis envisions small groups of maritime people already adapted to coastal and maritime subsistence, following the productive kelp forest ecosystems southward along the Pacific coast, living on shellfish, marine mammals, fish, and coastal plants, gradually working their way down towards South America, generation by generation, 1,000 kilometers by 1,000 kilometers, across thousands of years. The elegance of this model is that it explains Monteverde. If people came down the Pacific coast rather than through the interior, then there is no timing problem. The coast was accessible long before the ice-free corridor opened. People who were comfortable with maritime environments could have reached the southern tip of South America from Northeast Asia in a relatively short time, certainly within a few thousand years, without ever venturing into the maritime continental interior at all. The evidence for this coastal route is admittedly difficult to find directly, because the coastline those people would have walked along is now underwater, drowned by 12,000 years of sea level rise. Most of the sites they would have left behind are inaccessible to conventional archaeological investigation, sitting under tens of meters of ocean. But there are exceptions places, where the ancient shoreline is preserved above water, where sheltered bays and rocky promontories have resisted the rising sea, and in several of these places, archaeology has found what it expected to find. On the Channel Islands, off the coast of California, the Arlington Springs site produced human remains dated to approximately 13,000 years ago, among the oldest confirmed human remains in the Americas. The technology associated with those remains was not Clovis. It was a maritime technology tools adapted for fishing and sea mammal hunting, for a life lived at the edge of the ocean. On Haida Gwaii, the archipelago off the coast of British Columbia, archaeological sites have been found on shorelines that were above water during the Ice Age and have since been partially flooded, and the material culture found there suggests long occupation of a coastal environment extending back thousands of years before Clovis. Similar evidence has been reported from coastal sites in Baja California and from sites along the Pacific coast of South America, where ancient shell middens the accumulated debris of thousands of years of shellfish consumption, predate the Clovis horizon by substantial margins. The coastal migration model does not preclude a land-based migration through Beringia and the ice-free corridor. Most researchers today accept that there were probably multiple migrations, arriving by multiple routes at multiple times across thousands of years. The picture is not one of a single founding population, but of a series of arrivals, some coastal, some interior, some early, some late, each contributing to the genetic and cultural mosaic of pre-Columbian America. And the genetics, increasingly, supports this complexity. The ancient DNA revolution has transformed our understanding of pre-Columbian America in ways that are still being fully absorbed. For most of the 20th century, the genetic study of Native American origins relied on living populations, measuring variation in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages to trace ancestry backward through time. That work established several things clearly: that all Native American populations share ancestry with East Asian populations, particularly with peoples from northeastern Siberia, that there were several genetically distinct founding lineages corresponding to different mitochondrial haplogroups, and that the earliest divergence between Native American genetic lineages and their Asian relatives occurred somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago, well before the Clovis horizon, supporting a pre-Clovis entry into the Americas. But it was the recovery of ancient DNA directly from prehistoric skeletal remains, a technology that became practical only in the last decade or so, that began producing results genuinely surprising, even to researchers who had long suspected the Americas were more complex than the textbooks acknowledged. Ancient genomes from Anzic I, a Clovis-associated skeleton from Montana dated to approximately 12,600 years ago, showed the genetic profile expected of a direct ancestor of contemporary Native American populations. Clovis people were ancestral to modern Native Americans. That part of the story held. Then came the other ancient genomes, and they were not what anyone expected. A genome extracted from a tooth found at a site called Lapa do Santo in Brazil, belonging to a skeleton dating to approximately 10,300 years ago, produced a result that sent ripples of disbelief and excitement through the paleoanthropological community. The genetic profile of this individual, who has been designated by the research team as Population Y, showed an affinity not with Northeast Asian populations or with other Native Americans, but with populations from Australia, Papua New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. Australasian populations. In a 10,000-year-old skeleton from Brazil, this was not a marginal signal. It was not statistical noise or contamination. Subsequent analysis of other ancient skeletal remains from South America confirmed it. A pattern emerged from the oldest layers of the archaeological record in South America, a genetic signal from a population ancestral to modern Australasians, embedded in the deepest strata of the New World's human genetic history. These people, whoever they were, whatever name we eventually give them, had Australasian ancestry, and they were in South America before, or alongside, the ancestors of the populations who would eventually dominate the continent. They left genetic traces that fade through time, as the more numerous populations derived from Northeast Asian ancestors swamped their signal. But they were there, and somehow, impossibly, they had come from somewhere that, by any of the accepted models of human migration, was on the wrong side of the planet. How does a population with Australasian ancestry end up in South America 10,000 years ago? The question has generated several hypotheses, none of them entirely satisfactory, all of them extraordinary. One possibility is that they represent a very early wave of migration from Asia, a population that left Africa early, spread along the southern coastline of Asia to Australia and the islands of Southeast Asia, and then continued east across the Pacific, or north along the coast, arriving in the Americas long before the Northeast Asian populations that would eventually replace them almost everywhere. On this model, they are not Australasians who crossed the Pacific. They are cousins of Australasians, descendants of the same ancient population that settled both Australia and, somehow, the Americas, before their shared ancestry diverged. The Australasian signal in South American ancient DNA is, on this reading, not evidence of a trans-Pacific crossing, but evidence of a shared archaic ancestry, a deep connection between all the populations living at the margins of the expanding human world 20 to 40,000 years ago. Another possibility, more speculative, but not impossible, is that some ancestral Australasian population did make a trans-Pacific crossing, whether deliberately or by accident, carried by ocean currents or propelled by maritime technology we do not yet understand. The Pacific is vast but not uncrossable. Polynesian navigators, thousands of years later, would demonstrate extraordinary capabilities for open ocean travel, island hopping, across the world's largest ocean without any of the navigational technology available to modern sailors. Whether populations 10 or 20,000 years ago had comparable capabilities is unknown. The physical evidence for trans-Pacific contact at this depth of time is essentially non-existent, because anything wooden, fiber, or organic would have decayed completely over that timescale, and the ocean itself would have destroyed most trace of any crossing. What remains is only the genetic signal, faint but persistent, in the bodies of people who died 10,000 years ago in a cave in Brazil. The genetic story becomes even more complicated when you look at the Kennewick Man controversy, one of the most legally and politically charged episodes in American archaeological history, and one that illustrates with painful clarity how entangled the science of American prehistory had become, with questions of identity, rights, and sovereignty. In July of 1996, two college students wading in the shallows of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, stumbled on what appeared to be a human skull. They fished it out and called the police, who called the county coroner, who called the archaeologist, James Chatters, to examine it. Chatters, expecting to find the remains of a 19th century settler, or perhaps a Native American of relatively recent origin, began to examine the skull. What he found surprised him. The skull's morphology, its shape, its proportions, the angles and measurements that physical anthropologists use to assess population affinity did not match the profile he expected. The face was long and relatively narrow. The cranial vault was high. The features were, in the terminology of the field, more consistent with European or South Asian populations than with Northeast Asian populations. It looked, Chatters initially, and controversially reported, more like a European than a Native American. More bones were recovered from the riverbank. Eventually, the skeleton was nearly complete, one of the most complete ancient skeletons ever found in North America. Radiocarbon dating of a hand bone returned an age of approximately 9,200 years. Kennewick Man, as the press immediately dubbed him, was among the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever found in the Americas. What followed was a 9-year legal battle of remarkable bitterness. Local Native American tribes, the Umatilla, Yakama, Nez Perce, Colville, and Wanapum, invoked the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act to claim the remains for reburial. Archaeologists fought back in court, arguing that the scientific value was too great to allow reburial without study, and that a 9,000-year-old individual could not be shown to be ancestrally connected to modern tribes under any meaningful definition of cultural affiliation. The scientists eventually won the right to study the remains. When they did, several things became clearer, and several things became more complicated. Kennewick Man's morphology, it turned out, did not fit neatly into any modern population category. He was not European. The initial impression was the result of the unfamiliarity of very ancient American skulls, which often have morphological characteristics distinct from both modern Native Americans and modern Europeans. He was not obviously Northeast Asian either, at least not in the way that modern Native Americans typically are. He belonged to a morphological pattern seen in several very ancient American skeletons, a pattern some researchers associated with the Jomon people of ancient Japan, or with broader circum-Pacific populations, rather than with the interior Northeast Asian groups ancestral to most modern Native Americans. Then, in 2015, ancient DNA was extracted from the remains. The results resolved the legal and scientific controversy in one direction, while opening new questions in another. Kennewick Man was, Genetically, a Native American specifically most closely related to the Colville tribe, one of the groups that had sought his reburial. He was ancestral to modern Native Americans. The legal case for repatriation was, on genetic grounds, solid, and in 2017, the remains were repatriated and reburied. But the morphological question had not gone away. Why did very ancient American skeletons, not just Kennewick Man, but several others from the same period, including the famous Paleo-American skulls of Brazil's Lagoa Santa region, studied by Walter Neves, consistently show morphological features that diverged from modern Native Americans? The answer that has emerged from both the genetics and the morphology is that the founding populations of the Americas were more diverse than anyone had imagined. The earliest Americans were not one people but several, genetically and morphologically distinct, the products of different ancestral streams converging on the same continent across a span of thousands of years. Over time, the populations derived from Northeast Asian ancestors came to dominate through demographic expansion, through the displacement of earlier groups, through simple reproductive success, and the earlier, more diverse morphological signal was swamped, diluted, and eventually lost from the visible record. What remained was visible only in the ancient DNA, and even there, it was fading. This diversity in the founding populations of the Americas raises questions that go to the heart of what we mean by the 20,000 missing years. Because the genetic evidence suggests that some of these founding populations, or rather, the populations from which they derived, were separated from their Asian relatives by the founding bottleneck event, somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago. They were already in the Americas, or already distinct from the populations remaining in Asia, before the last glacial maximum, before the Clovis horizon, before any of the conventionally accepted timelines. Some part of the story of American prehistory begins before 20,000 years ago, and that story, for most of the history of American archaeology, has been a blank. To fill in even a partial picture of what that blank might contain, it is worth thinking carefully about what we know and what we can infer about the kind of people who were entering the Americas during those early, poorly documented millennia. They were not primitive by any meaningful definition of the term. They were fully modern Homo sapiens, or, in the scenarios involving the very earliest possible dates, archaic humans of comparable cognitive capacity, equipped with technologies and cultural practices that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of African and Asian prehistory. They knew fire. They knew how to make tools, how to process animal hides, how to construct shelters. If they came along a coastal route, they were maritime people, fishers, shellfish gatherers, sea mammal hunters with the boat building and navigation skills that marine subsistence requires. They could read weather, they could read water, they could orient themselves by stars and landmarks across hundreds of kilometers of unfamiliar coastline. What they encountered when they entered the Americas was, as already described, a world of extraordinary abundance. The megafauna that had evolved in North and South America during the Pleistocene had no experience of human hunters. The continent was, in a very real sense, a paradise of naivete animals that had never learned to run from an upright bipedal predator, that did not recognize the smell of humans as danger, that could be approached and killed without the long evolutionary dance of predator-prey co-adaptation that had shaped animal behavior in Africa and Asia over millions of years. For a skilled hunter entering this world for the first time, the hunting would have been extraordinary not merely because the animals were large and numerous, but because they were, by the standards of hunted prey, profoundly innocent. This naivete had consequences. One of the most debated questions in American prehistory is the cause of the mass extinction that wiped out most of North and South America's megafauna at the end of the Pleistocene. Between approximately 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, a breathtaking roll call of species disappeared from the continent. Mammoths and mastodons, ground sloths, glyptodonts, American horses and camels, short-faced bears, American lions and saber-toothed cats, the giant beaver, as large as a modern black bear, the dire wolf, the teratons, condor-like birds with wingspans of over 3 meters, more than 30 genera of large mammals. The majority of North America's megafauna went extinct within a geologically brief interval. It was the most dramatic extinction event the Americas had seen since the end of the Cretaceous. And it left the continent, for the first time in tens of millions of years, strangely empty of large animals. The debate over what caused this extinction is sometimes framed as a binary, climate change or human hunting. In reality, both played a role, and the interesting question is not which one, but how they interacted and which was primary. The end of the Pleistocene was a period of dramatic and rapid climate change. Temperatures were rising, ice sheets were collapsing, habitats were shifting. The grasslands that supported the great herds were shrinking and fragmenting as forests expanded northward into formerly glaciated territory. Many of the species that went extinct were cold-adapted creatures whose ecological niches were being compressed. Some extinctions may have been inevitable, regardless of human activity, but the timing is suggestive. Across the planet, wherever fully modern humans arrived in a landscape that had not previously been exposed to human hunters, a pulse of megafauna extinction followed within a few thousand years. This happened in Australia roughly 50,000 years ago, when the continent's remarkable Pleistocene megafauna, diprotodons the size of hippos, giant short-faced kangaroos, marsupial lions disappeared after the arrival of the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians. It happened on Madagascar, when humans arrived in the last 2,000 years. It happened on the islands of the Pacific, each new island suffering its own extinction wave as human settlers arrived. The Americas fit this pattern: human arrival, followed by megafauna extinction within a few thousand years. The correlation is not proof of causation, but it is consistent with what is called the overkill hypothesis, the idea that human hunters, moving through a landscape of naive prey, drove the megafauna to extinction or near extinction with a speed that the animal's reproductive biology could not match. The overkill hypothesis was most forcefully articulated by Paul Martin of the University of Arizona, who spent decades arguing that human hunting was the primary driver of Pleistocene megafauna extinctions globally. Martin's work was controversial. Some researchers felt he overstated the case, minimized the role of climate change, and underplayed the complexity of the evidence. The debate continues. But the important point for the present story is not who won the academic argument. It is what the extinction event meant for the 20,000 missing years. Because if humans arrived in the Americas significantly before 13,000 years ago, if there were people in Monteverde at 14,600 years ago, people at Meadowcroft at 16,000 years ago, people anywhere in the continent at 20,000 years ago or earlier, then those people were present during the height of the Pleistocene megafaunal world. They were hunting, or at least coexisting with, mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths and saber-toothed cats. They were part of a Pleistocene American ecosystem that no one living today has any direct cultural memory of. Their interaction with that world, what they hunted, what they feared, what they revered, what they competed with, was the formative experience of the earliest American cultures, and it is almost entirely gone. The physical evidence of those interactions, the campsites, the kill sites, the artifacts, the bones, is either buried under sediment and sea, lost to the decay of organic materials, or so sparse and scattered that the full picture may never be recoverable. What we can say is that the people of the missing 20,000 years were not primitive wanderers stumbling through an unknown wilderness. They were sophisticated, adapted, intelligent human beings who had been solving the problems of survival in marginal and demanding environments for their entire cultural history. And one piece of evidence, uncomfortable and contested but stubbornly persistent, suggests that at least one of the cultural traditions they carried with them across the world had very deep roots indeed. The Solutrean hypothesis is, by the standards of mainstream American archaeology, heterodox to the point of heresy. It was proposed in the 1990s by the archaeologists Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institution and Bruce Bradley of the University of Exeter, and it argues that some portion of the ancestry of Clovis technology, the elegant, bifacially flaked, fluted spear points that defined the Clovis culture derives not from Northeast Asia, but from Western Europe. Specifically, from the Solutrean culture of France and Spain, which flourished between about 22,000 and 17,000 years ago during the height of the last ice age. The argument begins with technology. Clovis points are made using a technique called overshot flaking, a controlled, difficult, highly skilled method of removing long, thin flakes from a stone core by striking it at a precise angle, thinning the piece from both faces simultaneously. It is a demanding technique that requires years of practice to master and produces a distinctive, characteristic signature in the finished artifact and the debris left over from its manufacture. Overshot flaking is not common in the archaeological record of Northeast Asia during the relevant period. It is, however, characteristic of Solutrean technology in Southwest Europe. Stanford and Bradley argued that the technological similarity was too specific, too complex, and too unlikely to be coincidental, that it pointed to a direct historical connection between the Solutrean stone nappers of Ice Age France and Spain and the Clovis stone nappers of Ice Age North America. How would that connection have been made? Ice Age Atlantic crossings are not, as it turns out, quite as impossible as they sound. During the last glacial maximum, the pack ice extended much further south than it does today in some models, reaching as far south as Portugal in the east and Labrador in the west, creating a near-continuous bridge of seasonal sea ice across the North Atlantic. A maritime population adapted to hunting seals and other ice age species, the kind of life lived by the ancestors of modern Inuit and by historical maritime peoples of the far north could, in theory, have worked their way along that ice edge from Europe to North America, hunting as they went, surviving on the rich marine resources of the glacial North Atlantic, arriving eventually on the eastern coast of North America. Stanford and Bradley pointed to similarities between the Clovis toolkit and the portable toolkits of historical maritime hunters in the Arctic, the emphasis on bifacial technology, the making of needles and other fine bone implements, the cultural signatures of a people who lived at the edge of the ice and knew how to exploit it. The Solutrean hypothesis was savaged by the academic mainstream with even greater ferocity than the pre-Clovis claims of Dillehay and Adovasio. The genetic evidence, it was pointed out, showed no European ancestry in Native American populations. The technological parallels could be explained by convergent evolution, the independent development of similar techniques in response to similar functional demands. The chronological gap between the end of the Solutrean culture in Europe and the first appearance of Clovis in North America was around 4,000 years' time, enough for significant cultural change in both directions. And the idea of Atlantic crossings, however theoretically feasible along the ice edge, had no direct archaeological support. Then, the genetics started producing results that complicated the picture. Ancient DNA from early European hunter-gatherers, specifically from individuals associated with the cultures that followed the Solutrean, including the Magdalenian and Epigravettian, showed a distinctive ancestry component that some researchers labeled ANE for Ancient North Eurasian. This ANE ancestry was not primarily derived from the populations of Western and Central Europe, who had been in place for tens of thousands of years, but from populations associated with the ancient North, the same broad ancestry pool that, mixed with East Asian ancestry, eventually produced the Northeast Siberian populations, ancestral to most Native Americans. The ANE component shows up in both early European hunter-gatherers and in Native Americans, not because Europeans crossed the Atlantic, but because both groups share a common ancient ancestry in the populations of the North Eurasian steppe, populations that spread across vast distances during the Ice Age and contributed their genetics to peoples as geographically distant as Western European hunter-gatherers and the ancestors of the first Americans. The connection is real. It is just not the connection Stanford and Bradley proposed. The Solutrean hypothesis, as originally formulated, is probably wrong. The genetic evidence makes a direct demographic connection between Solutrean Europeans and Clovis Americans, and extremely unlikely it would have left a clear European genetic signal in Native American populations that should be detectable and, so far, has not been found. But the underlying technological observation that Clovis napping has more in common with Western Eurasian tool traditions than with Northeast Asian ones remains unexplained. It is possible that the shared ancestry in the North Eurasian population carried technological traditions that were then expressed independently in both Europe and America. It is possible that the Clovis tradition was assembled from multiple technological inputs as populations merged and exchanged knowledge during the complex migration history of the late Pleistocene. It is possible that the similarity is more superficial than Stanford and Bradley believed. None of these possibilities is entirely satisfying, and the Solutrean controversy, like most of the controversies in this field, has not so much been resolved as archived. But there is one area of American prehistory where the evidence of pre-Clovis and early post-Clovis sophistication is so unambiguous, so physically imposing, so impossible to dismiss, that it demands extended discussion. That area is the earthworks of the eastern United States, and the cultures that built them, cultures that, until very recently, were routinely underestimated, mischaracterized, and, in some cases, attributed to mythological peoples rather than to the actual human beings responsible for them. The earthworks of eastern North America represent one of the great achievements of prehistoric engineering on the planet. They are not well known outside of North America, and even within the United States, they receive a fraction of the attention given to the pyramids of Egypt or the monuments of Mesoamerica. But in their scale, their complexity, their geometric precision, and the sustained organizational effort they represent, they are extraordinary. And they begin, in the deep timeline, far earlier than most people know. Watson Brake, in northern Louisiana, is a site that most people have never heard of, and this is a measure of how inadequately the deep prehistory of North America is communicated to general audiences. Watson Brake consists of a complex of 11 earthen mounds, arranged in an oval roughly 370 meters across, connected by low ridges to form a coherent enclosure. The mounds are not enormous by later standards, the tallest is about 7.5 meters high, but the complex as a whole represents a substantial undertaking, the product of considerable planning and coordinated labor. What makes Watson Brake genuinely remarkable, the fact that places it outside the conventional narrative of American prehistory, is its age. Watson Brake was constructed approximately 5,300 years ago, making it the oldest known mound complex in the Americas and one of the oldest known examples of monumental architecture in the Western Hemisphere. It was built around 3,300 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, at a time when Egypt was still in its predynastic period and Stonehenge was just beginning its first phase of construction. Who built Watson Brake? Not the Mississippian cultures that built the great mound centers of the later prehistoric period, Cahokia, Moundville, Spiro. Not any of the cultures familiar from textbook accounts of Native American prehistory. Watson Brake was built by people of what archaeologists call the Middle Archaic period, hunter-gatherers. Technically, though the term badly misrepresents the complexity of their society, they were hunter-gatherers who had lived in the lower Mississippi Valley for thousands of years, who had developed sophisticated knowledge of their local ecology, who had established stable, semi-permanent settlements around the productive aquatic resources of the region's rivers and lakes and bayous, and who had developed social and ceremonial practices complex enough to motivate the sustained collective labor required to build an earthen mound complex without metal tools, without draft animals, and without any of the other technological adjuncts that we associate with monumental construction. Watson Brake is not unique. In the lower Mississippi Valley, at least 15 earthwork complexes of similar or earlier date have been identified in the last few decades, the result of systematic survey work that has fundamentally changed our picture of the Middle Archaic. Poverty Point, the most famous and most extensively studied, was built around 3,200 years ago, substantially later than Watson Brake, but still remarkable. It consists of a series of 6 concentric C-shaped ridges, each one a platform on which houses were built, surrounding a central plaza. The ridges are enormous, each one a kilometer or more across, constructed from soil and debris accumulated over centuries of occupation. At the western edge of the complex, a single massive mound rises more than 20 meters above the surrounding plain, visible for kilometers across the flat Louisiana landscape. The total volume of earth moved to construct Poverty Point exceeds that of several of the Egyptian pyramids. And it was built by people who left no written records, no metal tools, no complex political hierarchy that we can identify with certainty, just the earthworks themselves, and the debris of their daily life scattered across the ridges. What was happening at Poverty Point? The site was clearly a major center of some kind, a place where people gathered from across a vast region. Objects found at the site have been traced to source materials from as far away as the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, the Appalachians, and the Gulf Coast, evidence of trading networks spanning more than 1,000 kilometers. Specific types of stone for toolmaking, specific minerals and pigments, specific raw materials for ornaments. All of it, moving through networks of exchange that connected Poverty Point to distant peoples and distant places. Whatever was happening there, whether it was trade, ceremony, politics, cosmology, or some combination of all of these, it was happening on a scale that required organization, communication, and sustained long-distance relationship maintenance of a kind we usually associate with far more complex societies. The story of the earthworks culture did not end with Watson Brake and Poverty Point. It evolved, branched, collapsed, and re-emerged across thousands of years of North American prehistory, producing some of the most extraordinary examples of prehistoric engineering and artistic achievement in the world. The Hopewell interaction sphere, which flourished across much of eastern North America between roughly 2,200 and 1,700 years ago, represents the most elaborate expression of the mound-building tradition's middle phase, a vast, loosely connected network of ceremonial and trading relationships that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, linking societies that shared artistic conventions, ritual practices, and the exchange of prestige goods, but were not, as far as we can tell, governed by any centralized political authority. The Hopewell peoples built geometric earthworks of breathtaking precision, perfect circles, perfect squares, perfect octagons, sometimes covering hundreds of acres that served as ceremonial enclosures, mortuary sites, and perhaps as astronomical observatories. Their artwork, produced in obsidian, copper, mica, and other materials transported over enormous distances, is among the most accomplished and visually striking in North American prehistory. And then there was Cahokia. Cahokia is the name given to the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, a site that sits just across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis, Missouri, in southwestern Illinois. At its peak, between roughly 900 and 800 years ago, Cahokia was home to an estimated 10 to 20,000 people, a population that would have made it one of the larger cities in the medieval world, comparable in size to London at the same period. The city was organized around a monumental core consisting of more than 100 earthen mounds, arranged in a roughly grid-like pattern across a central precinct of approximately 5 square kilometers. The largest of these mounds, now called Monk's Mound, is the largest earthen structure in North America and the third largest pyramid by volume in the world, surpassed only by the Great Pyramid of Cholula and the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises approximately 30 meters above the surrounding plain, covers about 14 acres at its base, and was constructed in multiple stages across more than 2 centuries of sustained effort. Surrounding the central monumental precinct was a wooden palisade, a massive defensive wall that enclosed the core area of the city, and enclosed within it a range of buildings, plazas, and structures whose functions we are still working to understand. Beyond the palisade lay the residential zones of the city, where thousands of people lived in rectangular timber-framed houses, arranged along planned streets and around open plazas. Archaeological evidence suggests a considerable degree of social stratification. Elite burials in the mounds, with grave goods indicating high status and access to exotic materials, contrasted with simpler burials in the residential zones. There was craft specialization. Specific areas of the site were devoted to the production of specific categories of goods, suggesting an economy organized around specialist producers and mechanisms of redistribution or exchange. There was long-distance trade materials from across the continent, including copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, all found at the site. Cahokia was, by any reasonable definition of the term, a city. A complex, stratified, specialized, planned, politically organized urban center of a kind that most Western education has consistently refused to associate with the indigenous cultures of North America. The reasons for that refusal are not scientific. Cahokia has been studied since the 19th century. The evidence for its complexity, its scale, its sophistication, and its urban character has been accumulating in the archaeological literature for generations. The reluctance to engage with that evidence, to say plainly, as archaeologists have been saying in their technical literature for decades, that Cahokia was a city, is a product of the broader cultural difficulty of accommodating the pre-Columbian Americas within frameworks of civilizational achievement that were designed, explicitly or implicitly, to justify European colonialism. At Cahokia's center, archaeologists discovered evidence of something they called woodhenge, a series of large circles created from evenly spaced wooden posts with clear astronomical alignments. The posts were positioned to mark the solstices and equinoxes with precision, creating a calendar system that tracked the agricultural year with accuracy sufficient for the intensive corn-based agriculture that supported Cahokia's large population. The astronomical sophistication implied by woodhenge was not an isolated phenomenon. It echoed similar astronomical knowledge embedded in the geometric earthworks of the Hopewell tradition and in the orientation of mound complexes across the eastern United States. The people of Cahokia, like the people of Watson Brake 5,000 years earlier, were watching the sky carefully and embedding what they saw in their constructions. Cahokia collapsed. Sometime in the 13th century, the population began to decline. By around 1300 CE, the city was effectively abandoned, its great mounds standing empty over a landscape that had been stripped of its forests to provide timber for construction and fuel. The causes of the collapse are debated: drought, soil depletion, political instability, epidemic disease, the disruption of trade networks, or some combination of all of these. The collapse of Cahokia fits a pattern recognizable in the archaeology of complex societies around the world, a pattern of rapid growth, high complexity, overexploitation of local resources, and eventual systemic failure. It is not a uniquely American story, but it was a story that left no one in the area of Cahokia when the first European explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley who remembered what had stood there. The mounds remained enormous and inexplicable, as the memory of the civilization that had built them faded from the oral traditions of the surviving populations. And when European colonists eventually settled the area, they assumed, as colonists in Africa had assumed about Great Zimbabwe, as colonists in Central America had assumed about the Maya that the monuments must have been built by some other people, not by the indigenous ancestors of the peoples they were colonizing, someone else, someone lost. This assumption, the denial of indigenous achievement, the attribution of prehistoric monuments to mythological peoples or lost civilizations, is one of the recurring pathologies of colonial archaeology, and it has had particularly deep roots in the Americas. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the earthworks of eastern North America were attributed in popular literature, and in some academic writing, to the lost tribes of Israel, or to the Vikings, or to a race of mound builders who had been exterminated by the ancestors of the people Europeans found living in North America when they arrived. This idea that Native Americans were latecomers who had displaced an earlier, more sophisticated, and now vanished race served obvious political purposes, providing a kind of precedent for the displacement of Native Americans by European settlers. If the Indians had done it once, the logic ran, then doing it to them was simply the wheel of history turning. This argument was not fringe, it was respectable. Thomas Jefferson investigated the mounds, recognized them as indigenous constructions, and was largely ignored. The mound builder myth persisted well into the late 19th century, before the Bureau of American Ethnology produced a definitive report in 1894, demonstrating conclusively, and from extensive evidence, that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of the Native American peoples then living in the same regions. The myth did not fully die even then. It persists today in popular culture, in certain pseudo-archaeological publications, and in the persistent unwillingness to grant pre-Columbian American cultures the complexity and achievement that the evidence demands. The missing 20,000 years, then, is not simply a gap in the chronological record of American prehistory. It is also a gap in the cultural framework through which that record has been interpreted, a gap produced by the selective blindness of a colonial scholarship that needed the Americas to have been empty, or nearly empty, or inhabited by simple peoples with simple cultures, in order to justify what was done to them. What fills the gap, when you look with clear eyes, is a story of extraordinary human achievement across an extraordinary span of time. The first people who entered the Americas whenever they came, however they came, were entering one of the most biologically diverse and resource-rich environments on the planet. Over the following thousands of years, their descendants explored every corner of 2 continents, from the Arctic tundra of Alaska to the tip of Tierra del Fuego, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic seaboard, from the Amazonian rainforest to the Atacama Desert. They developed technologies suited to every one of these environments, technologies for hunting, fishing, farming, construction, navigation, textile production, ceramics, metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, and a dozen other domains of practice. They spoke thousands of distinct languages, the greatest linguistic diversity on the planet, a diversity that itself testifies to the depth of their occupation, the length of time their ancestors had been evolving separate cultures in separate places. They built cities and ceremonial complexes. They domesticated plants and animals. They modified landscapes on a continental scale through burning, through planting, through the management of forests and waterways and soils, such that the apparently pristine wilderness that European colonists thought they were discovering was, in reality, a heavily managed cultural landscape shaped by thousands of years of human intention. The Amazon rainforest is perhaps the most striking example of this managed landscape phenomenon, and it is worth dwelling on because it has direct bearing on what happened in the Americas before and during the period that this documentary is examining. For most of the 20th century, the Amazon was assumed to be a pristine wilderness, a vast, impenetrable, essentially unchanged natural landscape that human beings had inhabited only sparsely and with minimal impact. This assumption was partly a product of the observable fact that, by the time European and American scientists were doing serious fieldwork in the Amazon, the human populations they encountered were small, mobile, and low density. But the reason those populations were small and low density was not that the Amazon had always been sparsely inhabited. It was that they were the survivors of the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas after 1492 brought with it diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, plague, to which the indigenous populations had no prior exposure and therefore no immune defense. The death toll is disputed and probably unmeasurable with precision, but the range of serious scholarly estimates runs from 50 to 90% of the pre-contact population within a century or two of first contact. In absolute numbers, this likely means the deaths of tens of millions of people. Some estimates put the pre-contact population of the Americas as high as 50 to 100 million, which would mean the deaths of 25 to 90 million people in a span of roughly a century and a half. It is, by any measure, one of the worst mortality events in the history of the human species, comparable in its demographic impact to the Black Death in Europe and possibly exceeding it in absolute numbers. The ecological consequences of this catastrophe were profound and are still not fully appreciated. When the first European explorers described the Americas, they were not seeing a pristine wilderness. They were seeing a continent in the early stages of rewilding a landscape from which the human hand had been suddenly and violently withdrawn, where forests were growing back over fields and gardens that had been cleared for centuries, where animal populations were expanding into ecological niches previously managed by human hunters, where the managed ecosystems of pre-contact America were beginning to revert to something more nearly natural. The Virginia of the first English settlers, the vast forests, the abundant game, the apparent emptiness was not an original condition. It was a consequence of the fact that the large, complex societies that had previously managed that landscape had been largely killed off by European diseases that arrived decades before European settlers. In the Amazon, this process operated on a scale and with a complexity that researchers are still working to document. There is now substantial evidence that the Amazon, particularly the western and central Amazon, supported substantial human populations prior to European contact. Earthworks geometric enclosures, similar in concept to the mound complexes of eastern North America, but different in form, have been found across the Amazon basin, buried under the forest canopy, and detectable only by aerial survey, and, in recent years, by LiDAR light detection and ranging technology that can penetrate forest cover and map the ground surface beneath. The scale of these earthworks is remarkable. In the upper Amazon of Bolivia and Brazil, survey work has identified hundreds of earthen enclosures, causeways, raised fields, and settlement mounds spread across vast areas of seasonally flooded savanna and forest. The largest of these complexes cover hundreds of square kilometers. The labor required to construct them over centuries and millennia implies populations in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps the millions, living in sophisticated agricultural societies that manage the land, the water, and the forest with a level of intentionality that we are only beginning to understand. The terra preta soils of the Amazon are a testament to this management. Terra preta, Portuguese for dark earth, is a distinctive, extremely fertile soil found in patches across the Amazon basin that was deliberately created by pre-Columbian populations through the incorporation of charcoal, bone, and organic waste into naturally infertile tropical soils. The process transformed the thin, nutrient-poor oxysols of the Amazon soils that, under natural conditions, can support only a few years of agriculture before being exhausted into deep, richly fertile soils that have maintained their fertility for centuries and that are still, today, highly prized by local farmers. Terra preta is not a natural phenomenon. It is a human creation, a soil engineering achievement of extraordinary sophistication, representing the deliberate improvement of an entire landscape's agricultural potential over generations of conscious management. And the patches of terra preta found across the Amazon cover an estimated 6 to 18% of the Amazon basin, an area ranging from hundreds of thousands to more than 1 million square kilometers of deliberately enriched soil. The Amazon was not a wilderness before European contact. It was a garden, an immense, continent-spanning garden, tended by millions of people across thousands of years. The LiDAR revolution that has transformed our understanding of the Amazon has also begun to transform our understanding of North American landscapes. In the forests of the Pacific Northwest, in the river valleys of the Southeast, in the grasslands of the Great Plains, aerial and satellite survey, combined with LiDAR mapping, has been revealing evidence of extensive landscape modification that was invisible from the ground. Ancient field systems, earthwork complexes, drainage networks, planting mounds, and the subtle traces of former settlement patterns that only become legible when seen from above. The scale of pre-Columbian landscape management in North America is now understood to be vastly greater than was recognized even 2 decades ago. The continent that European settlers believed they were receiving from God as an empty gift was, in fact, a landscape shaped by thousands of years of sustained human effort. And yet all of this, the earthworks, the managed soils, the engineered landscapes, the complex societies, is itself recent. It is, in the time frame of this documentary, nearly contemporary. The earthworks of Watson Brake were built 5,300 years ago. The terra preta soils of the Amazon were created over a span of time, beginning perhaps 3,000 to 7,000 years ago. The Clovis horizon, the earliest reliably documented widespread cultural tradition, is only 13,000 years old. The missing 20,000 years, the period between the earliest plausible human arrival in the Americas and the beginning of the documented archaeological record, is a period in which all of this had not yet happened. A period in which small populations, widely scattered across two vast continents, were learning their new world, adapting to it, discovering what was edible and what was dangerous, developing the technologies and the knowledge systems that would eventually support the complexity we see in the later record. It is a period that has left almost no physical trace, but it was not empty, and it was not simple. The question that haunts this period, the question that 20,000 years of missing evidence makes it impossible to fully answer, is whether there was anything in the Americas during those millennia that reached a level of complexity or achievement that we have entirely lost. Not in the Atlantis sense, not submerged cities or advanced technologies that would be recognizable to modern eyes, but in the sense of knowledge systems, social organizations, ecological relationships, and cultural practices that were sophisticated and functional and complete in themselves, and that were subsequently lost, not through some catastrophic destruction, but through the ordinary processes of cultural evolution, demographic replacement, and the simple passage of time. Every culture that disappeared from the Americas before the later periods left no descendants who could remember it. Every language that went extinct took with it ways of seeing and describing and categorizing the world that no longer exist in any form we can access. The diversity of the early Americas, linguistic, genetic, cultural, was immense, and most of it is gone. There is one cultural thread, however, that has never entirely been broken, and that connects the living present to the deep past in a way that deserves particular attention. Across the indigenous cultures of North and South America, there is a category of oral tradition that scholars have begun taking seriously in a way they have not always done. Oral traditions that appear to encode memories of geological and environmental events that occurred thousands of years ago. The oral traditions of coastal peoples describing times when the sea was much further away, when the land extended far beyond where the ocean now sits. Traditions describing great floods that came quickly, that swallowed the land, that drove peoples inland from shores they would never return to. Traditions describing the extinction of great animals, monsters, in many of the stories, or spirit beings, but animals whose descriptions are sufficiently specific to be matched with known Pleistocene megafauna. A memory, transmitted across hundreds of generations, of a world that no longer exists. The scientific study of oral traditions as vehicles for genuine historical memory has produced striking results. The linguist Patrick Nunn and the anthropologist Nicholas Reed published a study in 2016 examining Aboriginal Australian oral traditions about sea level rise, finding that multiple independent traditions from different parts of the Australian coast contained geographically specific descriptions of times when land now submerged was dry and inhabited descriptions that matched, with remarkable accuracy, the known timeline of post-glacial sea level rise between 7,000 and 13,000 years ago. If oral tradition can preserve accurate information about sea level change across 10,000 years in Australia, there is no strong reason to think it cannot do something similar in the Americas. The flood traditions of the Americas are among the most numerous and detailed in the world's oral literatures. Nearly every indigenous cultural tradition in North and South America includes a story of catastrophic inundation, a great flood that killed most people and animals, from which survivors escaped by climbing mountains, building boats, or being carried to safety by spiritual intervention. A recent interpretation, increasingly credible as the science of sea level reconstruction has advanced, is that these flood traditions encode genuine memories of the post-glacial inundation. The rapid rise in sea levels as the great glaciers melted between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, swallowing coastlines, drowning the low-lying lands that the earliest Americans had inhabited. The rising sea was not a local event. It was experienced simultaneously by coastal peoples everywhere. And what was lost beneath it, camps, middens, earthworks, tools, everything built and used on shores, now under 60 meters of ocean, is the missing evidence we are still trying to find. The scale of this inundation is difficult to fully appreciate. Along the Atlantic coast of North America, sea levels rose by more than 120 meters over roughly 10,000 years, meaning the shoreline was, at the glacial maximum, more than 200 kilometers further out to sea in places. Along the Gulf Coast, the flooding was even more dramatic. The Mississippi River, instead of debouching near New Orleans, ran across several hundred kilometers of exposed shelf before reaching the ocean. Whatever was on those shores, camps, middens, fish, weirs, shelters, earthworks, is now underwater, inaccessible to conventional archaeology. The rise was not smooth. Meltwater pulse, 1A. approximately 14,300 years ago, raised global sea levels by approximately 20 meters in a period of 3 to 5 centuries. On a shallow continental shelf, this translates to a coastline retreating by kilometers in a single human lifetime, a visible, generation-spanning transformation that people living on those coastlines would have experienced directly. It is at this moment that some researchers locate the origin of the global flood myths, not a single localized flood, but a worldwide catastrophe, experienced simultaneously by coastal peoples everywhere, seared into cultural memory with sufficient force to survive 10,000 years of oral transmission. What was lost in that inundation was not merely land and ecological resources. What was lost was the archaeological record of the earliest Americans. The people who had lived on those coastal lowlands for the 10 or 20 or 30,000 years before the sea swallowed them had left their traces there on shores that are now underwater, in landscapes that are now drowned. The Monte Verde site, 14,500 years ago, was 40 kilometers from the coast in a river valley, an inland site, and therefore preserved. If there were similar or older sites on the coast that those same people had occupied, they are gone. The Page-Ladson site in Florida was preserved because it was in a river sinkhole fed by groundwater, rather than on an exposed coastal shore. If there were contemporary sites on the actual Ice Age shoreline of Florida, which extended many kilometers further into the Gulf of Mexico than the modern coast, they are underwater. This is why the absence of evidence from the missing 20,000 years is not evidence of absence. The places where the evidence should be are, for the most part, inaccessible. Underwater archaeology, the study of submerged prehistoric sites, is technically demanding, expensive, and still in its relative infancy as a systematic discipline. A handful of submerged sites have been investigated along the coasts of North America, Europe, and Australia, and in every case where the conditions have been right for preservation, evidence of prehistoric occupation has been found. Submerged stone tool sites off the coast of Florida, submerged shell middens off the coast of California, submerged landscapes off the coast of the Yucatan, in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico that now cover the continental shelf. The potential for major discoveries in submerged prehistory is enormous. The resources devoted to systematic investigation of those sites are minimal. There is also the question of what has been found, but not published, or found and reburied, or found and lost in legal battles, or found and never properly investigated because no one allocated the resources. The history of American archaeology is not a history of neutral scientific inquiry. It is a history of discoveries made and ignored, of evidence suppressed and contested, of careers derailed by findings that did not fit the accepted model. Not through grand conspiracy, there is no single organization or individual coordinating the suppression of pre-Clovis evidence, but through the ordinary mechanisms of intellectual orthodoxy, peer review that privileges the expected finding over the surprising one, funding bodies that prefer incremental confirmation of existing models over costly investigation of anomalies, professional incentives that make it safer to align with the consensus than to challenge it. The Clovis First Orthodoxy survived for 60 years not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because the institutional and cultural apparatus of American archaeology had enormous investment in it, and the people with the most to lose from its collapse had the most influence over what got published and funded. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge that not every claim of extraordinary antiquity in American archaeology is valid. The field has attracted more than its share of wishful thinking, motivated reasoning, and in a few cases outright fraud. The Kensington runestone, supposedly carved by Norse explorers in Minnesota in 1362, is almost certainly a 19th century forgery. The Spirit Pond runestones, found in Maine in 1971 and claimed as evidence of Norse colonization of New England, are disputed. The Newark Holy Stones, discovered in Ohio in the 1860s and claimed to bear ancient Hebrew inscriptions, are almost certainly fakes. The popular literature on American prehistory is saturated with claims of ancient Egyptian visits, Phoenician colonies, lost continents, and pre-Columbian contacts of every imaginable kind, most of them without credible archaeological support. The intellectual challenge is to take seriously the genuine anomalies, the Monteverdes, the Meadowcrofts, the population-wide genomes, while maintaining critical standards that prevent wishful thinking from masquerading as history. That critical standard requires acknowledging what we do not know. We do not know the precise route or routes by which humans first entered the Americas. We do not know the precise date of first entry, though we can say with confidence that it was earlier than 13,000 years ago and probably earlier than 20,000 years ago. We do not know whether there were 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 founding waves of migration or how they interacted. We do not know what cultural practices, belief systems, or social organizations. The earliest Americans maintained the physical evidence is too sparse, and the organic materials that encode culture most directly have not survived. We do not know whether any of the very early populations identified by the ancient genetic evidence left living descendants, or whether they were replaced entirely by later populations. In the case of population Y, the Australasian ancestry population identified in early South American genomes, the genetic signal fades completely in the later record, which most researchers interpret as evidence of demographic replacement rather than cultural continuity. What we do know is that by the time the Clovis culture appeared 13,000 years ago, spreading rapidly across a continent, the Americas were not being settled for the first time. The Clovis people, whoever they were, and wherever exactly they came from, were entering a landscape that had been inhabited, explored, and in some areas intensively used for at least several thousand years before them. The stone tools found beneath the Clovis horizon at sites like Buttermilk Creek, the human remains at Arlington Springs, the occupied shelters at Monteverde and Meadowcroft, all of these tell us that there were people in the Americas before Clovis, that those people had their own technologies and their own cultures, and that the Clovis culture, for all its brilliance and all its subsequent success, was not the beginning of the American story. It was a chapter in the middle of a much longer book, and yet, in a very real sense, it is the beginning of the readable story, the point at which the evidence becomes dense enough to support detailed historical reconstruction. Everything before it is inference and probability, scattered data points in a vast silence. The 20,000 years before Clovis are the missing years, not because nothing happened in them, something extraordinary happened, the peopling of two continents, but because we cannot, yet, read what happened. The evidence is sparse, submerged, degraded, politically contested, and in many cases, simply not yet found. What has been found suggests a complexity and a depth that the orthodox account denied. What remains unfound may suggest far more. The tools are improving. Ancient DNA is extending the genetic record backward in ways impossible a decade ago. LiDAR survey is revealing landscape features invisible to ground-level observation, transforming our understanding of pre-Columbian landscape modification. Underwater archaeology is beginning to produce results from submerged sites along the coasts of North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Luminescence dating is pushing the reliable chronological reach of archaeology deeper into the Pleistocene. Computer modeling of ancient migration routes and climate change is generating testable predictions compared against new findings with every passing field season. There are specific areas where the next major discoveries are likely to come. The submerged continental shelves of both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of North America are the most promising. Along the Atlantic coast, the wide, shallow shelf contains extensive areas that were dry land or coastal plain during the glacial maximum, now sitting under relatively shallow water accessible to equipped divers and survey vehicles. In the Caribbean, the islands that rose from the sea at the glacial maximum were substantially larger than today, and the shallow banks between them were, in some models, coastal plains traversed by rivers and dotted with lakes. Any people who entered the Caribbean during the Ice Age would have found a very different archipelago and left traces on shores now submerged. The Yucatan Peninsula, with its vast networks of submerged caves, the cenotes and cave systems of the limestone aquifer, has already yielded extraordinary material. The skeleton known as Naya, a teenage girl found deep in the underwater cave system of Hoyo Negro, died approximately 12 to 13,000 years ago, falling into the cave when it was still dry. Preserved under meters of seawater, her ancient DNA confirmed the founding population ancestry expected of early Native Americans, while her skull morphology, like Kennewick Man's, reflected the more archaic diversity of the earliest Americans. As cave divers continue exploring the Yucatan's submerged passages, more skeletons are being found, some potentially older than Naya, pushing the record of early American life back toward and perhaps beyond the pre-Clovis horizon. Outside the Americas altogether, ancient genomes from late Pleistocene Siberia, from sites like Malta and Afontova Gora on the Yenisei River, have confirmed the ancient North Eurasian population that contributed significantly to Native American ancestry. Genomes from the Russian Far East, Kamchatka, and the shores of Beringia itself are filling in the picture of the source populations for American migration. What those genomes increasingly show is that the story was complex at the source, as well as at the destination, that multiple groups with different ancestries converged in the Beringian region during the late Pleistocene, mixed and separated, and mixed again, and sent multiple founding waves into the Americas at multiple times. The Americas were not peopled by a single group of migrants. They were peopled by the outcome of a long, messy demographic process that left traces in the genetics of every living Native American and in the archaeology of every pre-Columbian site. There is one further dimension of the missing 20,000 years that has been, until very recently, almost entirely absent from mainstream discussion of American prehistory, a dimension that forces us to think about not just who was in the Americas, but what those people built, traded, and knew in the periods immediately preceding the better documented later millennia. That dimension is the deep history of plant domestication and agricultural development in the Americas, and what it tells us about the timeline and complexity of early American social organization. The Americas were, independently of the Old World, one of the great centers of agricultural origin in the history of humanity. The crops domesticated in the Americas, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans, cassava, sweet potatoes, cacao, vanilla, peanuts, tobacco, sunflowers, and dozens of others form the basis of a substantial fraction of the world's food supply today. Every person alive on Earth benefits daily from the agricultural achievements of pre-Columbian American farmers. And the timeline of those achievements, when examined carefully, pushes back into a period that challenges the conventional picture of early America as a world of simple hunter-gatherers. Squash was being cultivated in the highlands of Mexico approximately 10,000 years ago, almost as old as the first evidence of agriculture anywhere in the world. Maize was domesticated from a wild grass called teosinte in the Balsas Valley of Mexico approximately 9,000 years ago. The process required the selection and cultivation of a plant whose wild ancestor had a cob roughly the size of a human thumbnail, transforming it through generations of careful selection into the large, productive crop that eventually fed millions. The degree of botanical knowledge, the patience, the intergenerational transmission of agricultural practice, and the social organization required to sustain that process across thousands of years speaks to cultural sophistication in the early Holocene Americas that the standard hunter-gatherer narrative cannot accommodate. Beans were domesticated independently at multiple locations across the same period. Cotton was domesticated in coastal Peru approximately 6,000 years ago, producing the fibers that would become foundational to Andean textile traditions. The breadth and independence of agricultural development in the Americas confirms what Watson, Brake, and Poverty Point suggest, that the social complexity necessary to support intensive food production and monumental construction was present far earlier and across a far wider range than is commonly recognized. And behind the domesticated crops lies the wild landscape management that preceded them, the burning, the weeding, the transplanting, the protection of favored species, the management of forest edges and waterways to create and maintain the semi-wild productive ecosystems from which domestication eventually emerged. This pre-agricultural or proto-agricultural landscape management is not easy to document archaeologically because it leaves less obvious physical traces than the full domestication of a crop species. But the oral traditions of many Native American peoples, combined with the ethnobotanical work of researchers who have studied how indigenous communities interact with wild plant resources, paint a picture of a relationship between humans and the plant world that stretches back to the earliest occupation of the continent. And that was, from the beginning, active and intentional, rather than passive and opportunistic. The people of the missing 20,000 years were not simply harvesting what nature provided. They were shaping nature slowly, generationally, cumulatively toward provision. This shaping extended to animals as well. The dog is the oldest domesticated animal in the world, derived from wolves somewhere in the Old World, East Asia, South Asia, or Europe, depending on which study you follow, somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago. Dogs entered the Americas with the first migrants and are documented in American archaeological sites from very early periods. But the Americas also had their own candidate for independent domestication, the turkey. Turkeys were domesticated in Mesoamerica approximately 2,000 years ago, probably initially for their feathers and ceremonial significance rather than for their meat, and they were subsequently traded and adopted across much of North America before European contact. The wild ancestors of the domesticated turkey Meleagris gallopavo ranged widely across North America, and the distribution of archaeological turkey remains suggests a complex, long-term relationship between human communities and wild turkey populations that preceded formal domestication by thousands of years. The alpaca and the llama domesticated from their wild relatives, the vicuña and the guanaco in the high Andes of South America, approximately 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, represent the most significant animal domestication. Achievements of pre-Columbian South America: the llama as a pack animal, the alpaca as a fiber animal, and both as food sources, were fundamental to the economy and logistics of Andean civilizations from the Chavin Horizon through to the Inca Empire. They enabled the transport of goods across the rugged Andean terrain, the maintenance of high-altitude agricultural systems through the provision of manure and draft power, and the production of textiles of extraordinary quality and variety. The Andean textile tradition is one of the great textile traditions in world history, and it rests, ultimately, on the relationship between Andean peoples and their camelid animals that was established thousands of years before any of the monumental civilizations of the Andes appeared in the archaeological record. The Andes themselves, the chain of mountains running down the western edge of South America, deserve particular attention in any account of American prehistory because they contain evidence of human complexity and technological achievement that is both extraordinary in itself and illustrative of how much of the deep American past we have not yet properly examined. The Norte Chico civilization, also known as Caral Supe, named for the site of Caral in the Supe Valley of coastal Peru, is the oldest complex society yet identified in the Americas, and one of the oldest in the world. It flourished between approximately 3000 and 1800 BCE, contemporaneous with the early dynastic period of Egypt, the Indus Valley Civilization, and the earliest Mesopotamian city-states. It was supported by an economy based on maritime resources, particularly anchovies harvested from the Humboldt Current, combined with irrigated agriculture in adjacent river valleys, where cotton was grown for fishing nets. At Caral itself, 6 large platform mounds were constructed around a central plaza, alongside sunken circular ceremonial plazas. The largest mound rises 28 meters, with a base measuring more than 150 meters on each side, and the site covers 66 hectares. There is no evidence of warfare, no weapons, no defensive architecture, no skeletal trauma suggesting an authority maintained through religion, exchange, and the management of shared resources rather than through force. The Norte Chico civilization lasted for roughly 2,000 years, the same duration as the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and then faded, its knowledge surviving only in fragments in the cultures that followed. The Norte Chico civilization is now fairly well known in academic circles, though it remains almost entirely absent from popular accounts of world history. Less well known, and more directly relevant to the deepest layers of this story, are the discoveries in the Atacama Desert of northern Chile, one of the driest places on Earth, where preservation conditions so extreme that organic materials can survive for thousands of years without degradation have yielded finds that challenge the standard timeline of American cultural complexity in fundamental ways. The Chinchorro mummies of the Atacama are the oldest deliberately mummified human remains in the world, older than the Egyptian mummies that are routinely cited as the earliest examples of this practice by several thousand years. The Chinchorro people were coastal fisher hunters who lived along the Atacama coast between approximately 9,000 and 3,500 years ago. Beginning around 7,000 years ago, 2,000 years before the first Egyptian mummies, they began practicing deliberate mummification of the dead, including infants and children. Their mummification techniques were sophisticated and varied. They removed internal organs, packed the body with reeds and clay, covered the skin with an ash paste, repainted the face and body with red and black pigments, and in some cases applied wigs of human hair. The practice was not random or improvised. It was systematic, technical, and evidently culturally significant, a set of practices transmitted from generation to generation across thousands of years by a people who had decided, for reasons we cannot fully recover, that the dead deserved preservation. What the Chinchorro mummies tell us, along with the Norte Chico civilization, the Watson Break earthworks, the Monteverde settlement, and all the other evidence assembled in this documentary, is that the history of human achievement in the Americas is far deeper, far richer, and far more complex than any mainstream account has yet fully communicated. The missing 20,000 years are not empty. They are full of migrations and adaptations, of extinctions and new ecologies, of technological innovation and cultural development, of the slow, patient, generational work of building knowledge systems that could support the later flourishing we see in the better documented periods. They are missing not because they were uneventful, but because the evidence of what happened in them is, for the most part, beyond our current reach, drowned by rising seas, buried by accumulated sediment, degraded by time, or unrecognized by scholars who were looking for different things. The deepening of the American timeline has implications that extend well beyond the question of when people first arrived in the Western Hemisphere. It has implications for how we understand the pace and capacity of human cultural development globally. The standard narrative of human prehistory in which complex social organization, monumental architecture, agriculture, and long-distance trade networks developed only in the last 10,000 years, only after the climatic stabilization of the post-glacial period, and only in a handful of geographically privileged locations, turns out to be a narrative constructed from the evidence that was most visible and most convenient to the scholars who constructed it. The Americas, examined seriously and without the distorting lens of the colonial assumptions that shaped 20th century archaeology, show that human beings were building complex, sophisticated, deeply adapted cultures wherever they went and for as long as they had been there. The capacity was not new. The expression of it varied with circumstance, ecology, and time. But wherever humans settled and stayed, complexity followed. This has a further implication that is perhaps the most important of all. The Americas, before European contact, were not a wilderness. They were not empty. They were not a gift from God to European colonists, a new world waiting to be claimed, a territory whose native inhabitants were too primitive to have established the kind of possessory rights that civilized people recognized. They were a world of deep, ancient, sophisticated human civilization, not uniform, not static, not simply comparable to the civilizations of the Old World, but complex, diverse, ancient, and legitimate in every sense that the word can bear. The destruction of that world, through disease, through war, through the forced displacement and cultural destruction of the colonial and post-colonial periods, was not a neutral historical event. It was the destruction of civilizations, plural, each of them irreplaceable, each of them the product of thousands of years of human creative effort and accumulated knowledge. And much of what was destroyed is now gone beyond recovery. The oral traditions of peoples who were reduced from millions to thousands in the space of a century. The agricultural knowledge of communities whose crops, fields, and land management systems were abandoned or actively suppressed. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge embedded in the earthworks and the architectural alignments of cultures whose sites are now under parking lots and shopping centers. The botanical knowledge of peoples who had spent thousands of years learning the properties of the plants in their environment, knowledge that modern pharmaceutical research is still partially recovering from the fragments that survived. The languages, hundreds of them, that went extinct with their last speakers, taking with them ways of conceptualizing and communicating about the world that no living person can now access. The music, the visual art, the ceremonial practice, the cosmological systems, the social philosophies of cultures that had worked out, over millennia, how to live as large groups of human beings in specific places without destroying those places. All of it reduced to fragments, to traces, to the occasional surviving artifact in a museum case. What remains, what survivors of the catastrophe preserved, what archaeologists and geneticists and linguists and ethnobotanists are slowly recovering, is enough to suggest the scale of what was lost. Not enough to fully recover it. The 20,000 missing years are, ultimately, missing because of what happened after them. The destruction was not a natural disaster. It was the systematic, sustained, deliberately imposed destruction of civilizations by other civilizations. Civilizations that told themselves a story in which the destruction was justified, necessary, or at worst regrettable. The story of the missing 20,000 years is, in the end, a story about what happens when one part of humanity decides that another part's history does not count as history, that another part's achievements do not count as achievements, that another part's claim on land, inhabited and shaped and known for 20,000 years, does not count as a claim. The science, the genetics, the archaeology, the linguistics, the paleoclimatology has been quietly dismantling that story for decades. Monteverde was accepted in 1997. The ancient DNA revolution produced population Y in 2015. The LiDAR surveys of the Amazon produced their first major results in the 2010s and have been producing more every year since. Hoyo Negro was published in 2014. The reassessment of Carroll, Watson Brake, Poverty Point, and Cahokia has been ongoing throughout this century, slowly revising the picture of pre-Columbian American complexity in the academic literature, even as the popular account has lagged behind. The gap between what the science now knows and what the general public has been taught is enormous. It is not a gap that exists because the research is esoteric or inaccessible. The peer-reviewed papers are there. The popular science books are there, Charles Mann's 1491, David Reich's Who We Are and How We Got Here, Tom Dillahay's The Settlement of the Americas, Bruce Trigger's A History of Archaeological Thought. The evidence is accessible. The story is available to anyone who looks for it. What has been missing is the mainstream narrative, the history curriculum, the documentary tradition, the textbook account, catching up to what the specialists have known for a generation. This documentary is a small step in that direction. A 2-hour account cannot do justice to 50,000 years of human history across 2 continents. It cannot resolve the debates that specialists are still having about specific sites, specific dates, specific migration models. It cannot tell the stories of the hundreds of distinct cultures and thousands of distinct communities that populated the pre-Columbian Americas with the detail and specificity they deserve. What it can do, what it has tried to do, is make the fundamental argument clearly, so that anyone watching understands. The story of the Americas before 1492 is older, richer, more complex, and more extraordinary than anything you were ever taught. The missing 20,000 years are not missing because they were empty. They are missing because we were told, for a long time, not to look. And when people started looking, what they found changed everything. There is a particular moment in the history of this research that deserves to be told at some length, because it encapsulates everything about the gap between what science knows and what institutions admit. And it involves not a contested site in an obscure valley, but one of the most famous prehistoric monuments in North America, a site visited by millions of tourists, studied by generations of archaeologists, and still, somehow, not fully understood. Serpent Mound in southern Ohio is, as its name suggests, a mound built in the form of a serpent, an enormous, sinuous earthwork stretching 420 meters from a coiled tail to an open mouth that appears to be seizing an oval feature interpreted as an egg, a sun, or a cosmological symbol. From the ground, it is nearly impossible to perceive as what it is. Only from the air does its form become fully legible, a work of art made, apparently, for a perspective its makers could not directly occupy, or perhaps for whatever they understood to inhabit the sky. The date of Serpent Mound was, for most of the 20th century, attributed to the Adena culture of roughly 800 BCE to 100 CE. Then, radiocarbon dates obtained in the 1990s suggested a much later date of around 900 CE, associating it with the Fort Ancient culture. Further work, in the 2010s, suggested both earlier and later occupation phases, and the current understanding is that the mound was constructed and modified across a long span of time by multiple cultural groups, each treating it as a sacred landscape worth reshaping and maintaining. The head of the serpent is aligned to the summer solstice sunset with sufficient precision to make coincidence improbable, and the mound sits within a geological disturbance approximately 8 kilometers in diameter, caused by ancient impact or cryptovolcanic explosion, whose relationship to the mound's placement may have been intentional. Serpent Mound is not the only earthwork in Ohio that raises questions about the astronomical knowledge and engineering capabilities of its builders. The Newark earthworks, originally covering more than 10 square kilometers of the Licking Valley in central Ohio, constituted the largest earthen enclosure complex ever built anywhere in the world. Constructed by the Hopewell culture approximately 2,000 years ago, they consisted of geometric enclosures, circles, squares, and an enormous octagon connected by parallel-walled avenues several kilometers long. The circles are nearly perfect. The squares are accurately right-angled. The octagon, covering approximately 20 hectares, is aligned to the most northerly moonrise of the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, with a precision that most researchers now accept as intentional. Tracking and predicting this cycle requires years of systematic observation and record-keeping. Encoding it in a monumental earthwork, maintained in place and aligned for 2,000 years, requires a combination of astronomical knowledge, geometrical skill, and organizational capacity that, stated plainly, is extraordinary. The Newark earthworks survive today only in fragments, partly because the city of Newark, Ohio, was built over much of the original site, and partly because a significant portion of the surviving earthworks was converted into a golf course in the 1930s. The Octagon Earthworks, the section aligned to the lunar standstill, is currently operated as a private country club, with access restricted to members. The oldest continuously operating earthwork astronomical observatory in the Western Hemisphere is also, in the present day, a private golf course. This fact speaks volumes about the cultural priorities governing the preservation of pre-Columbian American heritage. The broader context of the Hopewell Earthworks, the Newark Complex, the Hopewell site in Ross County, Ohio, the High Bank Works, and the dozens of other geometric earthwork complexes distributed across the Ohio Valley and beyond, is a context of continent-spanning ceremony and exchange. The Hopewell interaction sphere was not a state or an empire. It was a network, a loose, voluntary association of communities across an enormous geographic range, connected by shared ceremonial practices, shared artistic conventions, and the movement of exotic materials through long-distance exchange. Copper from the Great Lakes was hammered into ceremonial objects in Ohio. Obsidian from Yellowstone was knapped into blades that ended up in burial mounds in Illinois. Mica from the Appalachians was cut into silhouettes of hands, birds, and serpents, placed with the dead at sites hundreds of kilometers from the quarries. Marine shells from the Gulf, grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies, shark teeth from the Atlantic coast, all of it converging on the mound centers of the Middle West through exchange networks spanning a third of the continent. The objects traded were overwhelmingly ceremonial, made for ritual deposition in burial contexts rather than everyday use. This was not primarily economic exchange. It was a ceremonial network, a web of relationships maintained through the giving and receiving of sacred objects, the participation in shared rituals at shared places, the construction and use of earthworks that embodied a shared cosmological system. The Hopewell people were not trading for profit. They were maintaining connections between communities, between worlds, between the living and the dead, through the medium of exotic materials and the ceremonies that transformed them into sacred objects. This perspective that the great prehistoric earthwork traditions of North America were primarily expressions of religious and cosmological knowledge rather than of political or economic power is an important corrective to the past tendency to interpret pre-Columbian cultures through frameworks derived from Old World complex societies. The earthworks of Ohio and Louisiana and Illinois were not pyramids in the Egyptian sense structures built to glorify rulers and project state power. They were not temples in the Mesopotamian sense, institutions of economic redistribution organized around priestly elites. They were something else, something that the available analytical frameworks capture only partially, expressions of a way of being in the world, of understanding the relationship between human communities and the landscape they inhabited, between the living and the dead, between the earth and the sky. That was sophisticated and coherent and complete in its own terms. Understanding that coherence, or rather, beginning to appreciate its depth, requires taking seriously the evidence not just of material culture, but of ecological knowledge. One of the most consistently underappreciated aspects of pre-Columbian American cultures is the depth and sophistication of their ecological understanding, the knowledge of plants, animals, soils, water, weather, and the interactions between them that accumulated across thousands of years of careful, attentive, experiential engagement with specific environments. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Coast Salish, developed intimate knowledge of the salmon runs, the herring spawning cycles, and the complex ecology of the temperate rainforest over thousands of years of occupation. They managed these resources actively through the construction of fish weirs and salmon traps of sophisticated engineering, through selective harvesting that promoted forest growth, through burning of understories to maintain productive berry and root patches, through the transplanting and cultivation of camas, wapato, and dozens of other plant species. The salmon-intensive culture of the Pacific Northwest coast was not a simple economy of abundance. It was a carefully managed, technically sophisticated, ecologically informed, productive system that maintained its productivity for thousands of years. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built elaborate networks of canals, check dams, terraced fields, and cisterns for intensive agriculture in one of the driest environments on the continent. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, a complex of great houses, multi-story stone buildings containing hundreds of rooms, served as ceremonial and administrative centers for a regional system, integrating communities across more than 50,000 square kilometers. The Great House of Pueblo Bonito contained approximately 650 rooms and rose 4 or 5 stories in places, making it, for several centuries, the largest building north of Mexico. The Chaco road system, straight roads up to 9 meters wide, radiating outward from the canyon for hundreds of kilometers, ran directly across topography rather than around it, descending cliffs via carved stairways, oriented, cosmologically rather than practically, connecting sacred sites and landscape features of ceremonial importance as much as population centers. The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica represents the highest degree of formal, intellectual, and astronomical sophistication documented in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Maya developed, independently, a writing system capable of representing all the sounds of their language, the only fully developed writing system known to have originated in the Americas. They developed mathematical systems, including the concept of zero, and they maintained calendrical systems of extraordinary accuracy, tracking the solar year, the lunar cycle, and the cycles of Venus with a precision requiring centuries of systematic astronomical observation. The Great Pyramid at Chichen Itza is designed so that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the shadow cast by its stepped edges creates the illusion of a serpent descending the northern staircase, a shadow play of extraordinary precision, requiring exact knowledge of the sun's position on those specific dates and exact calibration of the pyramid's geometry. El Caracol, the cylindrical observatory at the same site, has windows aligned to the extreme positions of Venus with the precision of an instrument. The destruction of the Maya codices, the books by Spanish priests in the 16th century, represents one of the great cultural crimes in human history. The books contained astronomical tables, historical records, mythological accounts, botanical knowledge, and medical information accumulated over centuries of careful scholarship. One priest described the burning with a casualness that remains breathtaking. He burned them because they contained nothing but superstitions and devil's lies, and their owners wept, he noted, as if they had been part of their flesh. They had been part of their civilization. Their loss is, on any honest assessment, irreparable. What remains, across the Americas, after the destruction of the colonial period, is nevertheless extraordinary enough to demonstrate what was lost, extraordinary enough to insist that the missing 20,000 years are not merely an academic curiosity, but a human inheritance, belonging to all of us in the sense that all of human prehistory belongs to all of us, that the achievements of our species in any place and at any time are part of a shared story in which every chapter deserves to be told. The story of the Americas before 1492 is not a simple story. It is not a story of noble savages living in harmony with nature, the romantic fantasy that has sometimes replaced the colonial fantasy of emptiness. It is a story of human beings in all their variety, building and destroying, innovating and conserving, expanding and collapsing, managing their resources well and badly, living in peace and at war, creating beauty and committing violence. It is, in other words, a human story. Not a simpler human story than the one we tell about the old world, not a more innocent one, just a different one, equally complex, equally worth knowing, equally constitutive of what we are. Let us return, for the final portion of this documentary, to the question of the Ice Age itself, not as a setting for human migration, but as an active force shaping the cultures, the technologies, and the knowledge systems of the people who lived through it. Because one of the most important and most consistently underappreciated aspects of the missing 20,000 years is that the people who lived in them were not merely moving through an Ice Age landscape, they were adapting to it, learning from it, developing in response to it, and in some cases, actively managing it in ways that archaeologists are only beginning to document. The last glacial maximum, roughly 21,000 years ago, was the coldest point in the last glacial cycle. Average global temperatures were approximately 5 to 6 degrees Celsius lower than today. Sea levels were more than 120 meters lower. The great ice sheets covered a substantial fraction of the northern hemisphere's land surface. The landscapes of North America, south of the ice, were different from today's in fundamental ways, not just colder and drier, but differently organized, with plant communities and animal assemblages that have no direct modern analogue. The grasslands of the Great Plains extended further east and south than they do today, supporting the great megafaunal herds. The forests of the east were compressed into southern refugia, isolated patches of temperate woodland in the southern Appalachians, the coastal plain, and the river valleys of the Gulf Coast, from which they would expand northward as the climate warmed. The deserts of the southwest were smaller and moister than today, with large lakes filling basins that are now dry salt flats, fed by the meltwater and precipitation of a colder, wetter climate. The people who lived in this world adapted to it with a flexibility and ingenuity that is the hallmark of the species. In the northern latitudes, those who were present developed cold weather technologies, the stitched hide clothing, the insulated shelters, the fat-rich diets, the knowledge of ice and snow travel that enabled survival in conditions that would kill an unequipped person in hours. In the more temperate latitudes, they developed the hunting strategies and plant knowledge appropriate to the specific megafaunal communities and plant assemblages of their regions. Every environment required its own set of adaptations, and the variety of environments in the Americas, from Arctic to tropical, from high altitude to sea level, from desert to rainforest, required a corresponding variety of adaptive strategies, generating a diversity of cultures and technologies that was, in terms of its range, probably unmatched anywhere else on Earth. The warming that followed the last glacial maximum, beginning roughly 18,000 years ago and continuing, with interruptions, to the present, was a transformation of the world as dramatic as the cooling that had preceded it. Ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose, plant communities shifted northward, tracking the warming climate, arriving in newly deglaciated territory decades or centuries before the animals that depended on them, creating ecological dislocations that propagated through food webs in complex and sometimes catastrophic ways. River systems changed as the ice sheets melted, and meltwater lakes drained some rivers, growing enormously, others shrinking or vanishing. The great meltwater floods of the deglaciation, when the ice-dammed lakes of the glacial margin burst through their moraine barriers and sent walls of water across the landscape, were among the most dramatic events in the calm, post-glacial history of North America. The draining of glacial Lake Missoula, in what is now Montana, produced floods of almost incomprehensible magnitude flows, estimated at 10 times the combined discharge of all the world's rivers today, scouring the channeled scablands of eastern Washington, creating features so large and so strange that early geologists refused to believe they were the product of a single catastrophic flood. For any human populations in the path of these floods along the Columbia River Valley, across the lowlands of the Pacific Northwest, they would have been episodes of total destruction. Communities that had lived in river valleys for generations would have been swept away in hours. Landscapes that had been productive and familiar would have been scoured to bedrock and left buried under meters of flood debris. The survivors would have carried memories of catastrophe, the water coming without warning, the world ending, the slow, uncertain process of rebuilding. Some of those memories, perhaps, found their way into the flood traditions that have been maintained across Pacific Northwest cultures for thousands of years. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions between approximately 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, interrupted the post-glacial warming with consequences that would have been devastating for North American populations. Its cause remains debated. Some researchers favor an abrupt change in North Atlantic Ocean circulation. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes a fragmented comet or asteroid impact around 12,900 years ago, triggering wildfires, climate change, and megafauna extinctions. That hypothesis remains controversial but has been supported by findings of cosmic impact markers, nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules at the Younger Dryas boundary at multiple sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Whatever its cause, the Younger Dryas was abrupt. Greenland ice cores suggest temperatures dropped by several degrees within decades, and it lasted roughly 1,200 years before temperatures rebounded equally abruptly. Megafaunal populations already under pressure from warming and human hunting received a further shock that may have been the final blow for many species. When the Younger Dryas ended approximately 11,700 years ago, the world that emerged was the world we inhabit today, the Holocene, with its forests, grasslands, and wetland habitats, its smaller fauna, and its human populations, reorganizing their subsistence strategies around resources that no longer included the great Pleistocene herds. This transition from large-game hunting to broad-spectrum foraging to horticulture and agriculture is one of the most important transitions in human prehistory. And in the Americas, it is particularly complex because it happened independently in multiple regions across a span of several thousand years, driven by different ecological conditions and social dynamics in each case. In Mesoamerica, the pressure to intensify food production in a landscape of seasonal rainfall and variable soils drove the domestication of maize, beans, and squash over the period from roughly 10,000 to 7,000 years ago. In the Andes, the high-altitude grasslands and tuber-rich highlands favored a different trajectory, leading to the domestication of potatoes, quinoa, and camelids, and the development of the terrace agriculture and water management systems that supported Andean civilizations. In eastern North America, the rich aquatic resources of the river valleys and coastal wetlands supported dense hunter-gatherer populations who, eventually, began the experimentation with plant cultivation that led to the independent domestication of several crop species, including sunflowers, sumpweed, and goosefoot, by approximately 4,000 years ago. Each of these agricultural transitions was preceded by a long period of proto-agricultural management, of the kind already described: burning, transplanting, selective harvesting, the cultivation of wild plants in semi-managed landscapes. And behind that proto-agricultural management lay the deep history of ecological knowledge that had been accumulating since the first people set foot in the Americas. The knowledge of what to eat, what to avoid, when to harvest, where to find water, how to read the seasons, how to manage fire, how to navigate by stars and landmarks across unfamiliar territory. This knowledge, transmitted orally, demonstrated practically, Embedded in the rituals and stories and daily practices of communities was the most important inheritance that the people of the missing 20,000 years passed on to their descendants. Not monuments, not artifacts, knowledge, the knowledge of the land. It is this knowledge, the ecological, botanical, astronomical, and geographical knowledge accumulated by indigenous Americans across thousands of years that has provided the most persistent thread of connection between the deep past and the living present. Where the archaeological record is silent, where the genetic record is fragmentary, where the oral traditions have been disrupted by the catastrophe of colonization, the knowledge of the land persists in practical form in the managed landscapes, the cultivated plants, the traditional agricultural and ecological practices that surviving communities have maintained through centuries of pressure and disruption. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the alliance of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later Tuscarora peoples, maintained one of the most sophisticated political systems in pre-Columbian North America. The Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, the oral constitution of the Confederacy, transmitted through elaborate strings of wampum beads, established principles of representative governance, the separation of powers, and the peaceful resolution of inter-community conflict that predated the Enlightenment political philosophy, inspiring the American founding by several centuries. Whatever its precise origins, the Confederacy was a well-established institution with centuries of precedent when the first Europeans encountered it sophisticated enough to conduct complex diplomacy with competing colonial powers and to maintain political independence for nearly 2 centuries after contact. The political sophistication of the Haudenosaunee was not unique. Across North America, indigenous political systems ranged from the band societies of the Great Plains, organized around kinship and consensus, to the highly complex chiefdoms of the Pacific Northwest coast, where hereditary elites managed the redistribution of resources and the maintenance of elaborate ceremonial systems. The political landscape of pre-contact North America was diverse and dynamic, characterized by shifting alliances, territorial disputes, long-distance diplomatic relationships, and the full range of political behaviors that human societies everywhere produce when they have enough surplus to support specialization. It was not a political wilderness awaiting the imposition of civilized governance. It was a world of sophisticated, historically aware political actors, operating within traditions as deep and as elaborated as anything the European settlers brought with them. Understanding all of this, the depth, the complexity, the sophistication, the full humanity of the pre-Columbian Americas requires a sustained effort of imaginative reorientation that is difficult precisely because our habitual ways of thinking about the deep past of this part of the world are so deeply marked by the assumptions of colonialism, the empty continent, the wandering hunters, the simple tribes. These images are not merely wrong, they are wrong in a specifically motivated way. Wrong because it was useful for certain people to be wrong in exactly this way. And dismantling them requires not just accepting new facts, but examining the assumptions that made the old stories seem natural and inevitable. What does it mean to say that the Americas have a missing 20,000 years? It means that the first chapters of the American story, the most ancient chapters, the chapters that would tell us the most about human adaptability, human resilience, and the deep roots of the extraordinary cultural diversity of the pre-Columbian Americas, are largely inaccessible to us. Not because they are gone, though some of the evidence is gone, but because we have not yet developed either the tools or the institutional will to recover what remains. The submerged coastlines have not been systematically surveyed. The ancient DNA has not been extracted from all the samples that could yield it. The oral traditions have not been fully recorded and analyzed. The LiDAR surveys have not been flown over all the landscapes that might reveal hidden earthworks and modified terrains. The ethnobotanical knowledge of communities whose traditional ecological knowledge was accumulated over thousands of years has not been adequately documented before the last fluent practitioners age out of reach. There is still an enormous amount to find, to record, and to interpret. What we do have, the Monte Verde settlement, the Meadowcroft rock shelter, the Page-Ladson Mastodon butchery site, the ancient genomes of population Y, the mounds of Watson Brake, the cities of the Mississippian tradition, the great earthwork observatories of Ohio, the Chinchorro mummies of the Atacama, the managed landscapes of the Amazon, is enough to make the fundamental argument beyond any reasonable doubt. The Americas have a deep prehistory. That prehistory was complex, diverse, and accomplished. It deserves to be known, studied, protected, and taught, not as a curiosity, not as a supplement to the main story, not as a politically inconvenient complication, but as a central chapter in the story of what human beings have done with the world they inherited. The missing 20,000 years are missing because we were not looking. It is time to look. Over the coming decades, the emerging science of the ancient Americas will continue to rewrite what we know. Environmental DNA genetic material preserved in sediments, in lake beds, in cave deposits, is beginning to allow researchers to track the movement of ancient human populations through landscapes where no physical remains survive, simply by detecting the traces of human-associated microbiomes in the sediment record. The radiocarbon calibration curves are being refined, extending the precision of radiocarbon dating and pushing the reliable chronological reach of the technique back further into the Pleistocene. New sites are being identified not just by professional archaeologists, but by indigenous communities whose oral traditions have guided researchers to locations of significance, by citizen scientists with aerial photography and survey drones, by the sheer accumulation of chance discoveries in a continent where construction, erosion, and agricultural activity routinely expose the buried past. The pace of discovery is accelerating. The consensus is shifting. The story is opening. And the story that is opening the real story of the Americas, from the first arrival of human beings to the world that 1,492 found and destroyed, is one of the greatest in the history of our species. Older than the pyramids, older than the written word, older than agriculture, a story of people moving through ice and forest and desert and ocean to find a world no human being had ever seen, and then spending 20,000 years learning it every valley, every season, every plant, every star. Learning it until it was home. If you have watched this far, you already understand something about that story, and about how much of it is still waiting to be told. The next video in this series will take that story further east, further north, and further back in time, examining the specific genetic and linguistic evidence for the pre-Clovis migrations and asking what the deepest layers of Native American oral tradition can tell us about the world before the world we think we know. If that is a question you want to pursue, subscribe to this channel and make sure notifications are turned on. The history that was hidden is the history that matters most.